It was the silver glint that stopped them, just a sliver of light breaking through wet soil where a tree had fallen after the storm. A watch face cracked, but still catching the sun, its band tangled in roots like a relic the earth had been hiding. The words on the back were faint, but I knew them before anyone read them aloud. Love, Anna, 1983. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and share this, if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. When I think back on that summer of '83, what I remember first is the quiet. Grants Pass wasn't the sort of place that rushed through anything. Mornings came slow, with fog sitting low on the river, and the sound of logging trucks groaning down Highway 199. Folks waved from porches, left their windows open to catch the smell of pine and sawdust, and talked about rain the way other towns talked about politics. It was a simple rhythm: steady work church on Sundays, coffee at Harriet's Diner by 6:30. I was a reporter for the Daily Courier, then 20-something, and still believing every small town was built on truth. I knew William Cartwright in the way you know good men in places like ours by the sound of his truck and the way he held the door open for you at the hardware store. He worked at the Timberline Mill out on Redwood Avenue. 12-hour shifts, sometimes more when a shipment ran late. Widowed 5 years by then, he wore his grief quietly tucked behind a polite smile and a devotion to his daughter Anna. Their house sat at the end of Willow Creek Lane, a modest single story with a porch swing that never stopped moving even when no one was sitting there. I'd pass it most evenings on my way home from the paper, and 9 times out of 10 I'd see them outside William, watering the rose bushes his late wife planted. Anna crouched beside him, pulling dandelions she pretended were weeds worth fighting. He'd tease her about her stubborn streak, and she'd grin like she'd just won something important. That's the image that stays with me, a father teaching patience through gardening. His sleeves rolled her hair, tangled from the summer wind. The town knew them as a pair. When she wasn't in school, Anna shadowed her dad everywhere, helping him wash the car on Saturdays, sitting on the bleachers during the mill's softball games, cheering loud enough to embarrass him. He never missed a match, never missed a Sunday service, never missed picking her up from school in that cream-colored Oldsmobile he kept spotless. In a town where so many families had cracks you could see from the street, they seemed solid, 2 people holding each other up after the world had already taken enough from them. Martha James, the neighbor who watched Anna when William worked late, once told me she'd never met a man so predictable in the best sense. "You could set your watch by him," she said, and she meant it. Every morning at 5:15, headlights swept across her curtains, same route, same time. Every evening by 6, he was back, except Fridays when he stopped for groceries. Routine was how he held life together. That summer began hotter than most. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, and even the river looked tired, dragging itself between the rocks. People lingered on porches late into the night, listening to crickets and the occasional hum of a distant motorboat. I remember sitting outside my apartment above the paper's office notebook on my knee, watching the stars blink through haze. That's when William would sometimes stroll by on his way back from the night shift, nodding and greeting, his shirt still smelling faintly of cedar and oil. He always looked like a man measuring his day by honest work. Then came June and Anna's excitement over Father's Day. She saved up money from babysitting and odd chores to buy him something real, as she put it. She told Martha, who told me that she'd found a silver wristwatch at Jensen's Jewelry downtown, a simple thing, nothing flashy, but engraved on the back with the words, "Love, Anna." When she gave it to him, William wore it like it was made of gold. You could see the glint of it on his wrist when he shook hands at church the next morning. I covered a small piece on the mill's safety renovations that week and stopped by the plant. William greeted me near the saw-line sweat on his collar hard hat under his arm. "You write something kind," he joked, "so the boss doesn't think we're all falling asleep out here." He looked tired that day, focused but different. I chalked it up to the heat. Later, a few men told me he'd been distracted, that he'd stared off toward the tree line during lunch breaks like something out there had caught his attention. Back then, nobody thought much of it. By early July, the talk around town was about the 4th of July parade and how the county fair might be canceled if the drought held. William had promised Anna they'd go to the river that weekend instead, maybe roast hot dogs near the shallows. "We'll find some cool shade," he'd told her at the grocery store checkout while I was behind them in line. She beamed up at him, clutching a pack of marshmallows like treasure. I didn't know that would be the last time I'd see them together. The nights started feeling different around that time. Maybe it's hindsight, but the air seemed thicker, quieter. Martha mentioned once that she'd seen headlights parked on River Road near the turnout past the bridge late one evening, an old pickup idling with no driver in sight. She didn't think much of it until later. William had said something similar at the diner a few days before, how he felt like someone was watching near the road. We all laughed, told him it was probably a stray dog or kids sneaking beers. In a town that small, fear didn't have many places to hide, so we ignored it. Friday, July 15th was hot enough to melt tar. The mill cut hours early because machines were overheating, and I saw William outside the grocery store again loading bags into the Oldsmobile. He waved, smiled, asked if the paper ever ran good news anymore. He said he was taking Anna to a classmate's birthday party at the YMCA the next day. "She's growing up too fast," he said, shaking his head. 13 going on 30. Then he checked his watch, the silver one, before climbing in and driving off toward Willow Creek Lane. That weekend was uneventful at first, just the drone of cicadas and the smell of rain that never came. Saturday morning, I filed a story about local drought relief and stopped by the diner for pie. Martha was there talking about how Anna had been giddy about the pool party. She said William had promised to pick her up by 6, maybe grab ice cream afterward. Simple plans, ordinary words, the kind that mean everything once they're gone. By dusk, the air felt restless. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains, low and distant. The streetlights flickered earlier than usual. Around 8, I walked home past the Cartwright place. The porch light was on, burning through the dark like it was waiting for someone. Inside, no movement. Just that swing rocking gently in the warm wind creaking against the silence. That light stayed on long after midnight, a small, stubborn glow against the dark. From the road you could see it through the rain beginning to fall steady and unbroken. It should have meant safety. But that night it felt like something else entirely, like the beginning of a silence this town still hasn't learned how to fill. That night the rain came harder than anyone expected. It wasn't a storm so much as a long, patient downpour, the kind that muffles a town until all you can hear is the hiss of water against rooftops and the steady heartbeat of it hitting the street. I remember standing at my window past midnight, watching that single porch light on Willow Creek Lane glow through the rain. It never went out. By morning I knew something was wrong. It started with Martha James calling the sheriff's office. Anna hadn't come home from the sleepover at the YMCA. She'd waited at the curb until after sunset, clutching her towel and her backpack, watching every car that passed. He said 6 o'clock she told the birthday girl's mother, her voice small but certain. When no one came, the woman tried calling the Cartwright house. No answer. By the time Martha drove over to check the house, looked the same as it had the night before, light still burning, mail still in the box, William's work boots gone from beside the door. The deputies were dispatched around 1 a.m. They found his Oldsmobile just after dawn, sitting in a turnout along River Road 5 miles from town. The car was locked. Inside the wallet, the keys, the folded instruction booklet for that new silver watch. No sign of struggle, no broken glass, not even a footprint in the mud. The tires were clean, like he'd parked there on purpose. I drove out there that afternoon with a camera from the paper. The turnout was narrow, framed by Douglas firs that leaned so close you could smell the sap in the heat. Sheriff Drummond was already there, leaning against the hood of his cruiser hat, tipped back, staring at the car like he was trying to make sense of something that refused to explain itself. "Everything's tidy," he said quietly. "Too tidy." The search started that same day. Deputies marked the roadside with orange tape while volunteers fanned into the woods calling his name. The dogs caught a trace at first from the driver's side door across the ditch into the brush, and then it just stopped 40 yards in like a thread cut midair. They circled for hours, but the trail ended in nothing. I remember the sound of their voices echoing through the trees, all those men calling the name of someone they couldn't see. It was the kind of silence that starts to feel personal, like the woods themselves are refusing to cooperate. By sunset, the turnout was cordoned off. Reporters milled around, pretending they weren't frightened by how quickly daylight could make a man disappear. I took a photo of the car from across the road, doors closed, windows streaked with rain. No sign of life inside. Later, when I developed the film, I realized the porch light back at his house must have still been burning. That thought stuck with me more than anything. Over the next few days, Grant's Pass moved in unison. Flyers went up on gas pumps and telephone poles. People stopped by Martha's porch with casseroles and speculation. At the mill, men whispered over lunch about what might have happened, a robbery gone bad, a hit and run, maybe even a secret life no one knew about. But those of us who'd known William couldn't make that theory fit. He was steady as the sunrise, the kind of man who left notes for the babysitter and paid his bills early. He'd lost his wife young, and every ounce of care he had went straight into Anna. There was no way he'd just drive off. Anna stayed with Martha after that first night. I visited her on Tuesday to drop off a few things from the sheriff's office, copies of her father's photo, a list of questions they wanted her to answer again. She was sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, the skin around her eyes, swollen from crying. On her wrist was a cheap little imitation watch, silver-colored plastic. She caught me looking and said softly, "It's just like his." Then she looked out the window toward the lane and whispered, "He's coming home." I didn't have the heart to tell her how empty that road looked. The investigation moved fast at first. Drummond's deputies checked every motel, every hospital, every pawn shop within 50 miles. They dragged the river twice, sent divers down where the current slowed beneath the bridge. Nothing. By Thursday, state police joined in, and a helicopter buzzed the treetops until fuel ran low. Still nothing. It was as if he'd stepped out of his car and been erased. The only piece of information that offered any shape came from a long-haul truck driver who claimed he'd seen a man walking along River Road near dusk the evening William vanished. Said he looked out of place wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, moving slow like he was lost. Could have been anyone. Could have been him. The description fit half the town. Still, Drummond logged it, circled the time, 6:45 p.m., and noted it lined up with when Anna started calling home. The problem was, if it was William, why had he left his car locked behind him? Days turned into weeks. Each morning, the sheriff's office opened the same maps, circled the same routes, and each evening they closed them again, edges soft from handling. I wrote the stories, but even my words began to feel useless. Search continues for missing father. No new leads in River Road case. Readers wanted reasons, and all I could give them were empty details, the kind that said a lot without saying anything at all. I started noticing small things then. The way the air changed when you drove past the turnout. The way dogs refused to bark near it. The way Anna, who'd once talked nonstop about school and friends, went quiet whenever someone mentioned her father's name. She began leaving flowers there every Sunday, always white lilies, always at the same spot where the gravel met the brush. Sometimes I'd pass and see her standing by the guardrail, hair pulled back, hands still. I never stopped. Some grief needs space. By August, people began moving on the way small towns do. New stories filled the front page. A highway expansion, a high school scandal, a record salmon run that year. The Cartwright case slid to page 4, then disappeared altogether. But for Anna, time didn't move. She kept wearing that replica watch, the kind that ticked a little too loud. I remember hearing it once when she came to the newsroom with Martha, just that steady rhythm cutting through the hum of typewriters. It was around then that one of the mill workers stopped by my office after hours. He was jittery eyes darting toward the door. Said his name was Frank. He told me William had been acting strange the week before he disappeared, staring into the trees at lunch breaks, checking his watch every few minutes, muttering about someone following him. Frank swore he'd brushed it off until now. He wasn't crazy, he said. He was scared. That word hung in the air long after he left. I wrote it in my notebook, underlined it twice, and never printed it. Fear without evidence just becomes gossip. The summer ended with no answers. The sheriff held one last press conference outside the courthouse, reporters leaning in close as he announced the search would scale back, but the case would remain open. He said it the way you might promise a child that something broken could still be fixed. Afterward, he stood apart from the cameras, rubbing his temples. "It's like he vanished between seconds," he murmured. "You know what I mean. There's no transition, no struggle, no sound. Just gone." I did know. Everyone in town did. That kind of disappearance leaves a scar you can't photograph. That fall, the trees turned early. By September, River Road was a tunnel of amber leaves, and the turnout looked almost beautiful again, like it hadn't swallowed a man whole just months earlier. Drivers stopped pulling over. The tape was gone, the dirt smoothed over by rain and time. The only reminder was the small wooden cross Martha planted there with Anna's permission, a simple thing with a single word burned into it: hope. Years passed, but that summer stayed lodged under my ribs. Every so often, I'd hear a rumor, a sighting in Eugene, a letter sent to a relative, a stranger who looked just like him at a rest stop. None held up. Anna grew older, went to college, married, had children of her own. She carried her father's story like a shadow that followed her into every new season. She told me once when we met for coffee in town that she still dreamed of headlights turning up that driveway. "Sometimes I can hear the engine," she said quietly. "It sounds real until I wake up." Then came the summer of 2004. I was long retired by then, keeping a small archive of local history for the county museum. It had been 21 years since William disappeared. The day the sheriff called me, I thought it was about some old photo collection. Instead, his voice was different, lower, careful. "You're going to want to hear this, Dan," he said. "A couple of hikers found something out by River Road." I felt the air leave me. For 2 decades, that name had meant nothing but absence, and now it had a sound again. When I got there, the forest was soaked from rain. A Douglas fir had fallen across the trail, its roots ripped clean from the earth. Between them, something glinted, a fragment of metal half buried in mud. They said the hikers thought it was trash at first until one turned it over and saw the engraving. The deputies had it sealed in a clear evidence bag by the time I arrived, but even through the fogged plastic I could make out the words, "Love Anna, 1983. The same watch I'd seen on his wrist the summer he disappeared. I stood there a long time listening to the wind moving through the branches above us. 21 years and the forest had kept it secret until now. The sheriff said they'd reopen the file, bring in forensics, maybe even call in the state lab. But all I could think about was that porch light still burning against the rain all those years ago, waiting for a man who never came home. The watch was proof that he'd been there, proof he hadn't walked away on his own. And as I drove back into town, windshield wipers slapping slow across the glass, I realized something I'd never said out loud before. Maybe the question wasn't where William went, but who had made sure he couldn't return. That thought followed me home steady as the rain, and somewhere deep down I knew the story I'd tried to file away was about to surface again, just like that watch buried under the roots. The day after the watch was found, I met Sheriff Drummond at the old turnout. The place looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because time had taken the edges off. The road had been repaved since the 80s, and the trees had grown thick again, pressing in like they were trying to hide something. The deputies had strung yellow tape between the trunks, not because they expected to find anything new, but because it felt wrong not to. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. You could hear the river faintly below, a soft hiss against the rocks. The watch had already been sent to the lab by then, but the impression of where it had lain, the small hollow between the roots, was still there, dark and damp, as if the forest had exhaled it. Drummond crouched beside it, tapping the edge of his pen against his notebook. "Someone put it here," he said quietly. "Roots don't grow like that around an accident." I didn't answer. It wasn't a question. That night I pulled William's old file from my cabinet at home, the one I'd kept out of habit more than purpose. The papers were yellowed at the edges, the ink faint but legible. Typed reports, interview notes, a few of my old articles clipped to the back. Reading them again felt like walking backward through fog. Same words, same dead ends. The last line from Drummond's closing memo read, "No further evidence. Case inactive until discovery of remains or credible lead." Now we had a watch, but no William. When the county reopened the investigation, it felt like the town woke up from a long nap. Folks who hadn't said his name in years were suddenly remembering things. Most of it was half-truths or stories retold too many times. But every once in a while, something stuck out, something I couldn't shake. Like the man who stopped me outside the grocery store to say he'd seen an old pickup parked near that turnout for several nights before the disappearance. Or the mill worker who claimed William had been arguing with a younger employee, Dennis Avery, the week he vanished. Over safety violations, he said, and something about paperwork. Avery had left town not long after moved down to California and, as far as anyone knew, never looked back. I passed that along to Drummond, and he nodded without much comment. He'd already heard it. "We'll track him down," he said. "See what he has to say." Weeks passed, and each day brought a new thread that never quite tied to anything. I joined the detectives a few times at the sheriff's office, mostly to take notes for a piece I was writing for the Historical Society. They let me sit in the corner as long as I kept quiet. The new detectives were younger, sharper in tone, less patient with silence. They re-interviewed everyone, old co-workers, softball teammates, even parish members from the church where William used to volunteer on Saturdays. The stories varied in small but telling ways. Some said he'd been happy the week before he disappeared. Others said he'd seemed withdrawn, tired. One man remembered him checking his watch over and over during a lunch break like he was waiting for something that never came. Another recalled him saying he felt watched near the same stretch of road where his car was found. It was the kind of phrase that gets under your skin when you know how things end. When they finally tracked down Dennis Avery, it made the local news. He was living near Bakersfield working construction. His interview was short. He admitted to disliking William, called him by the book, said he made enemies easily but denied any involvement. Claimed he was home that weekend, though no one could verify it. "Probably out fishing," he said with a shrug. The tone bothered me, that casualness when speaking about a man who disappeared. Still, the sheriff's office couldn't prove anything, so they let him go. Another dead branch in a forest of them. As the investigation dragged on, I started visiting the turnout more often. Not officially, not as a reporter or historian, just to see it. There was something strange about that place, the way the wind funneled through the trees, the way sound seemed to vanish as soon as it left your mouth. You could stand there at midday and feel watched even when no one was around. I'd find myself tracing the edge of the dirt where the car once sat, imagining him stepping out, locking the doors, glancing down at his watch, maybe hearing something, a rustle, a footstep, and turning toward the tree line. Every possibility unraveled the same way. He'd take one step too far, and that was the end of it. Anna came up from Portland to see the watch herself once the lab finished its report. They couldn't recover fingerprints or DNA. The years had taken too much. The engraving was still clear enough, though, and she recognized a small dent on the band. "He scratched it when he was fixing the sink," she said, touching the glass through the evidence case. "That's his." Her voice wavered on the last word. Watching her face in that moment, I realized the truth of what the watch meant. For the investigators, it was evidence. For Anna, it was confirmation that her father hadn't walked away. Someone had taken him from that road, and someone had buried the proof. The discovery stirred something in the town. Again, old unease, new whispers. At the diner, people debated whether it was found too neatly too close to the old turnout, like someone wanted it to be found. Why bury a watch and not a wallet, one man said. Why wait 20 years for it to show up? Theories sprouted like weeds. Some swore he'd stumbled across something illegal near the river, poachers, smugglers, maybe a drug operation. Others leaned toward the personal, a jealous co-worker or a stranger passing through. A few still believed he'd run off despite everything. In small towns, theories don't need evidence to survive. They just need repetition. I remember Drummond sitting with me one evening in his office, both of us staring at the map spread across his desk. He'd marked the known Points House YMCA car, the area where the watch was found. "We're missing a middle piece," he said. "The space between the last person who saw him and wherever he ended up. That's where the truth is." He rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing at the map. "You ever think about how some cases feel designed to stay unsolved?" I didn't answer. The question didn't need one. By winter, the investigation had slowed again. The lab reports were inconclusive, the leads exhausted. The watch became more symbol than clue. Anna started writing letters to the governor, pushing for state-level attention. It worked at least for a while. A task force came down, reviewed the case, even ran new analyses on the old evidence boxes, fibers, soil samples, the car interior. Still nothing. The earth had swallowed what it didn't want to give back. Through it all, I kept thinking about that instruction booklet folded in his glove compartment. It was such a small thing, almost absurd. A man vanishes and what's left behind is a car, a wallet, and a watch manual. I mentioned it to Drummond once, half joking, and he said, "People hang on to things they plan to use." It took me a moment to realize what he meant. Maybe William had planned to read it again, fix the watch if it broke. Maybe that's why it stayed in the car. He didn't plan on being gone long. The winter rains came heavy that year, washing out the edges of River Road. The turnout turned to muck. The cross Martha had planted nearly toppled. I went out there once during a storm and found the place empty again. The tape gone, the evidence flags buried under leaves. The trees leaned close, their trunks slick with rain. I stood there until my coat was soaked through, thinking about how time rearranges what we see. The same ground, the same air, but everything shifted just enough to make memory unreliable. By spring, the town settled back into its quiet. The story slipped back into folklore the way unsolved things do. Still, a few of us kept paying attention, Drummond, myself, and one younger detective named Harris, who refused to let it rest. He believed someone local had done it, someone who'd known William's schedule, known that he'd be alone that evening. "He didn't just disappear," Harris said to me once outside the station. "He was removed." That word hung between us a long time. In late April, a magazine from Portland ran a feature on the case. They titled it, "The Father Who Vanished," printed the photo of William wearing that watch, the same one now rusted in evidence. The article ended with a question I couldn't shake. If time reveals truth, then what does it mean? When time itself disappears? I clipped it, added it to my file, and thought about the way that watch had lain underground for 2 decades, silent patient waiting for someone to notice. Sometimes I think about whoever buried it, whether it was done out of guilt or spite or fear. Maybe it slipped from a pocket during a struggle. Maybe it was placed carefully under the soil. Both versions feel possible. But the one that haunts me most is the thought that it was deliberate, that someone wanted it to be found eventually, just not soon enough to matter. By the time summer rolled around again, the case was quiet, but not forgotten. The sheriff's office still kept the file open, but everyone knew what that meant. We'd reached the point where truth was buried deeper than we could dig. Still, every now and then, I'd see Anna back at the turnout, standing near the guardrail, hand resting on her own wristwatch, the same model as her father's. She'd stay there for a while, then walk back to her car without a word. Watching her fade into the distance always left the same hollow feeling in my chest, like watching the ending of a story you already knew would never resolve. And yet part of me couldn't stop waiting for one more clue to surface, one more whisper from the earth. The watch had come back. Maybe someday something else would too. By the time that first spring rain settled into a steady rhythm, the search for answers had turned into something else entirely, less an investigation, more a haunting that moved through our town like fog. Every conversation began and ended with that same question: who buried the watch? The forest had surrendered one piece of truth, but not the rest. Sheriff Drummond's team kept combing the archives, calling old witnesses, following tips that fizzled before they even warmed up. Still, you could feel it, the sense that something close to understanding hovered just beyond reach. I spent most of those weeks driving the same road William had taken that July afternoon from his house on Willow Creek Lane to the YMCA, then out toward the turnout. It wasn't work anymore. It was a ritual. I'd park where the Oldsmobile had once sat, engine off, radio silent, and listen to the forest breathe. Every sound out there meant something: a distant jay, a branch cracking under its own weight, the pulse of the river beyond the trees. I tried to picture what he might have seen before he vanished, what made him lock his doors so neatly and step into that wall of green without a trace. Drummond met me out there one morning. He'd aged since we first worked the case, his hair mostly gone, eyes set deep from years of squinting against unsolved things. He leaned on the hood of his truck, motioning toward the edge of the trees. "We found tool marks in the soil," he said, "old, shallow. Could be nothing. Could be everything." The rain had softened the ground, making every print look fresh. He told me they'd sent new soil samples to the state lab, though neither of us believed time would be kind to them. The only thing that seemed to survive the years was that watch and maybe the guilt of whoever buried it. When the state forensic team came down from Salem, they worked the area like an archaeological dig, slow, methodical, patient. They unearthed fragments of metal bits of rusted wire, even a buckle that might have belonged to a tool belt. None of it could be tied to William. Every time a deputy called possible find, the air around us tightened, and then it would break again with a quiet no match. The silence that followed each disappointment was heavier than any storm. Meanwhile, the town couldn't stop talking. Every bar, every church potluck, every line at the post office hummed with theory. I overheard one woman say she'd bet her life it was that coworker from the mill, Dennis Avery. Another swore she'd seen William arguing with a stranger near a gas station days before he vanished. Rumor turned memory into clay, reshaping it however people needed it to fit. Even Anna wasn't immune to the stories. She came up for the second anniversary of the watch's discovery and sat beside me at the diner. She looked tired, older than her years, the kind of tired that comes from reliving the same day over and over. "You think whoever did it might still be out there?" she asked. I told her I didn't know which was true, but what I didn't say was that I thought about it every night. Somewhere out there, someone knew exactly what happened on that road. And they'd carried that secret longer than Anna had been without her father. In May, the sheriff's office got permission to reopen part of the riverbank downstream from the turnout. The theory was that the heavy rains that winter might have dislodged something, maybe bones or personal effects. I went with them, walking the slick mud with camera and notebook out of habit. The water moved slow, brown, and cold, curling around driftwood like it was studying us back. A search dog barked once near a cluster of roots and everyone froze. But when they dug, it was just a length of rope tangled with debris. I remember Drummond closing his eyes for a second, whispering, "It's never nothing, and it's never enough." He didn't mean for me to hear it, but I did. Later that summer, An unexpected piece of evidence surfaced from a place no one expected: the archives. A retired deputy cleaning out his garage found an old film roll from 1983. Photos taken the morning after William's car was discovered. The negatives were brittle, but when developed, one image caught our attention. It showed the car from a distance, the surrounding brush still untouched. Just behind the left rear bumper, half hidden in shadow, was what looked like the corner of a folded tarp. No one had mentioned it in the reports. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was overlooked. Drummond sent a team to the site again, though 2 decades of storms had rewritten the ground. They found nothing of the tarp, but that photograph, it reignited the idea that someone else had been there that night tidying the scene before the deputies ever arrived. Anna came down again that fall to see the picture. She stood over it on the sheriff's desk, tracing the blurry outline with her finger. "It looks planned," she said softly. "Like he didn't just vanish. He was cleaned away." Hearing her say it out loud made something inside me shift. We'd all thought it, but she was the only one who dared to make it real. The story started reaching beyond our county again. Newspapers from Portland, even Seattle, called for comment. "Oregon's Father Who Vanished," one headline read. The renewed attention brought tips from people who swore they remembered seeing a man matching William's description walking along the road that evening, or a truck idling near the turnout. Each call felt like an echo of 1983, the same vague shapes repeating themselves. The sheriff's office followed what they could, but by then we all knew how fragile memory becomes after 20 years. I spent long evenings in my office rereading everything I'd written about the case, all those old clippings with my name printed beneath headlines that promised closure we never found. I caught myself fixating on one detail: the way William's car had been locked, keys inside wallet untouched. It was the same detail that bothered Drummond back then. "Too neat," he used to say. Now, with the watch buried and the ground rearranged, it felt almost ceremonial, like whoever did it wanted to erase the man, not rob him. There's a difference. Robbery is desperation. Erasure is control. That winter, the task force held one last meeting before the holidays. Drummond invited me to sit in more out of respect than necessity. We went over everything: Avery's alibi, the truck sighting, the missing tarp, the buried watch. When the conversation ended, no one moved. The youngest detective, Harris, finally said, "You ever wonder if the watch was left on purpose? Not lost, not buried by chance, left as a message." The room went still. Drummond stared at the wall for a long time before answering. If it was a message, he said it came from someone who thought we'd never be smart enough to read it. After that meeting, I drove back down River Road. The air was cold enough to sting. I parked at the same turnout and stepped out into the dark. Snow had started to fall thin and quiet, blanketing everything in a way that made the world feel paused. The ground where the watch was found was covered again, sealed under a layer of white. I thought about how time buries truth not just in dirt, but in people, memories fading, witnesses dying, stories changing to fit what makes sense. The forest around me creaked under the weight of snow, and I realized that if we didn't find something soon, William's story might end up like the others half-remembered, told over coffee by people who never knew him. The following spring brought a glimmer of movement. A hiker reported finding what looked like an old campsite half a mile upstream from the turnout, charred rocks arranged in a ring, fragments of cloth, and a rusted coffee can. Deputies hiked out to examine it. Nothing identifiable, but the area matched the truck driver's account from years earlier, a man walking near dusk, confused, heading north. The discovery didn't prove anything, but it reopened a question we'd stopped asking. What if William hadn't been taken immediately? What if he'd walked deeper into those woods, met someone out there? For weeks, the search grid widened again, drones scanning the terrain that dogs and men had combed decades earlier. They found nothing new, but the effort brought the community back together in a way I hadn't seen since '83. Neighbors volunteered meals for the search teams. Local kids left notes for Anna at the sheriff's office. Small gestures that said, "We still care." In towns like ours, that's all you can offer when justice stays quiet. Then one morning in June, I got a call from Drummond. His voice was low even for him. "Dan," he said, "we're calling it. Case'll stay open, but we're out of road." I could hear the weariness behind his words, the acceptance that comes when every lead has collapsed under time's weight. "We keep the file open for her," he added, meaning Anna, not for us. I didn't argue. Some silences can't be filled with reasons. That evening, I found myself back on River Road again, parked at the turnout engine, idling. The forest was lush and green from weeks of rain. I sat there until twilight blurred the edges of the trees, until the headlights of passing cars painted the guardrail gold for a moment before disappearing. The same road, the same stretch of earth, unchanged yet heavy with what it remembered. Somewhere beneath that ground lay a man's watch, once bright, now darkened by rust and time. A symbol of a promise broken and buried, then accidentally unearthed long after it could save anyone. I reached for my pen, wrote a single line in my notebook, and closed it. The case might have stalled again, but the story hadn't finished. Not yet. Something about it still felt alive, waiting. And I knew that as long as that road existed, somebody, maybe me, maybe Anna, would keep listening for what it was trying to tell us. It's strange how some stories don't really end. They just grow quieter. The investigation closed again that summer, at least on paper. The reports were boxed and shelved, the evidence sealed, and cataloged, the watch resting under glass at the sheriff's office. But for those of us who had lived inside its silence, it didn't feel finished. It still doesn't. After the last official meeting, Sheriff Drummond retired. He told me he was done chasing ghosts, but the way he said it, you could tell he didn't believe himself. He stayed in town, tended a small garden, and stopped by the diner most mornings, sitting at the same corner booth William used to favor. We'd nod to each other, talk about the weather, and then fall into that comfortable quiet people share when there's too much history between them to fill with words. He passed away 3 years later. Peacefully, they said. I hope it was. Anna moved back to Portland. She started teaching art at a public high school and raised her 2 kids with a kind of steady grace that reminded me of her father. Every Father's Day, she still drives down to River Road. I know because she leaves fresh flowers by the turnout, the same spot where his car was found. Some years, she leaves lilies, some years wildflowers. She once told me she brings whatever's in season. He liked things that grew on their own, she said. The town eventually folded the Cartwright case into its folklore. It's what happens when a mystery outlives the people who tried to solve it. New folks move in, hear fragments of the story at a potluck or a Little League game, and it turns into something softer, easier to hold a father gone missing a watch that came back decades later. But those of us who were there remember the hard edges, the long nights, the rain, the sound of search dogs fading into the dark. A few years ago, the sheriff's office put together a small exhibit on unsolved cases for the county fair. I went to see it out of habit more than anything. They had a glass display with items from different investigations, photographs, badges, even old hand-drawn maps. And in the center, under its own light, sat William's watch. The silver was dull now, the engraving nearly lost under rust, but I could still make out the words. Love, Anna. 1983. People walked past it slowly, heads bowed a little, not out of fear, but respect. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring through the reflection of my own face, and for a moment I could hear the old newsroom again, the clatter of typewriters, the low hum of voices trying to make sense of the senseless. The watch was never just a clue. It became something else, proof that a man's life could still speak long after he was gone. Proof that love, when carved deep enough, doesn't fade, even when metal does. Sometimes late at night I still drive out to the turnout. The road hasn't changed much. The trees have grown taller, their roots knotted through the soil like the veins of time itself. The guardrail's been replaced twice since '83, but the forest keeps its memory well. I park in the same spot where his Oldsmobile once stood, kill the engine, and let the quiet settle. The air there feels heavier somehow, like it's holding something it won't give back. Once a few summers ago, I met a young deputy there by chance. He was new, didn't know me, didn't recognize the name Cartwright right away. When I told him, he nodded slowly, said he'd read the file during training. It's one of those cases, he said, the ones that never sit right. I told him that was the truth of it, that some stories don't ask to be solved, only remembered. He looked out at the tree line for a long time and said, "Seems like the forest doesn't forget either." He was right. You can feel it in the way the wind moves through that stretch of trees. There's a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. I sometimes wonder if William ever made it that far in. Did he follow the sound of water, or was he led by something else? A light, a voice, a promise he thought he could trust. Whatever happened, it was quick, efficient, and buried deep. Whoever was responsible must have carried that silence all these years, just as we did, though for different reasons. Maybe that's punishment enough. Maybe not. The case never produced a suspect solid enough for charges. No body was found, no confession ever came. The watch remained the last true link between what we knew and what we lost. But over time, I began to understand that not every story of justice ends with a courtroom. Sometimes it's in the way people refuse to let the truth die quietly. Anna's persistence forced the state to re-examine dozens of cold files, and because of her 2 other families, eventually found closure. Her father's case gave meaning to theirs. She told me once that she took comfort in that maybe her loss had helped someone else's story find an ending. As for me, I stopped writing about the case years ago, but I never stopped thinking about it. Every so often, someone would send me a clipping, another article, or anniversary piece, and I'd see my own name in the byline of the first reports, faded like an old watermark. I'd remember the sound of rain on my window that first night, the glow of the porch light at the Cartwright house, how it burned through the dark like it was waiting for someone who never came home. Some images just don't let go. What I've learned in the years since is that time doesn't heal every wound. It just teaches you how to live around the emptiness. The ache softens the questions dull, but they never vanish. They linger in the small things, the way a certain road bends the sound of the river after a storm, the face of a child who grows up to look just like the parent they lost. Memory changes form, but it doesn't leave. There's a plaque now at the turnout. The county put it up the same year Drummond passed. It's simple. In memory of William Cartwright, 1944-1983. A father, a neighbor, a name that endures. Below it, in smaller letters, are the words Anna requested. Time tells what silence cannot. Every time I see it, I think of that watch, its hands frozen, its face cracked, and yet somehow still keeping the kind of time that matters. I like to think that wherever William ended up, he knows the world didn't forget him. That his daughter carried his name forward, that strangers still whisper his story when they pass that stretch of road. Maybe that's what survival looks like when the body's gone, being remembered even by people who never met you. The night before I moved out of Grants Pass for good, I drove that road one last time. The sun had just gone down the horizon, a deep orange, fading into blue. The forest looked peaceful, almost forgiving. I parked for a while, stepped out, and stood by the plaque. Fireflies blinked near the edge of the trees. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of the mystery pressing down. Just quiet. Just air. Just the hum of a world that kept turning. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the one I'd carried through every phase of this story. On the last page, I wrote a single line. He didn't vanish. He was seen. And that still matters. Then I tore it out, folded it once, and tucked it under a stone beside the plaque. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about acknowledgement, one last gesture to a man whose absence shaped so many lives. As I drove away, headlights tracing the curve of the road, I caught one last glimpse of that spot in the rearview mirror. The plaque, the trees, the faint shimmer of light where the river cut through the dark. It looked almost ordinary again. Maybe that's the truest kind of peace, when a place that once held pain becomes just another piece of landscape, and the people left behind can finally breathe without waiting for an answer. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for fame, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Some stories deserve to be remembered, even when the ending never comes.